Welcome to Grain Rainbows, the podcast for people coming out LGBT plus later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. Wherever you are on your journey, I hope this podcast will help you feel less alone. Before we get started, I want to remind you that you can find more episodes of Grain Rainbows at grainrainbows.com, and you can subscribe for free in your favorite audio app. I'd love to hear from you. You can write to me at grainrainbows@gmail.com. Grain Rainbows launched in November 2018, so this month is its third anniversary. To celebrate, I've decided to follow a slightly different format. First, I'm going to provide some advice for new listeners. Then I'm going to share some reflections on the last 3 years. This will be some personal reflections, and also I'm going to talk about how the show has evolved. And then I'm going to talk about the future of the show. Before I get started, I want to thank all my guests and especially listeners who have shared their personal journeys. Your feedback has also helped me know that these stories have helped many people. If you're new to Grain Rainbows, I hope that after you listen to this episode, you will go back to episode 1 and listen to them in order. However, I've recently also updated the webpage grainrainbows.com so that on the About page, you can see several different categories with episodes that fit into different categories. These categories are author reviews, book reviews, faith-related stories, people of color, transgender, and veterans. I haven't explicitly labeled male or female guests because you can kind of figure that out for yourself. I would encourage you, as I said, to listen to all the episodes. A lot of people say they start out by listening to the people that they identify with, but then they go back and listen to the others and find that those are meaningful too. That's why I suggest a 1 through 55 approach. When I launched Grain Rainbows 3 years ago, in November of 2018, I'd been out for about 3 years. But I'd already been podcasting since 2006. So I saw podcasting as a way to connect with others on a similar journey. Most of the coming out literature focuses on youth and young adults, and it doesn't address the unique challenges that we face coming out later in life. I also wanted to share LGBT plus history and to make listeners aware of the challenges facing LGBT plus elders. The early episodes of the show also reflect my experience and comfort with interviewing authors. 2 of my earliest guests were the historian Lillian Faderman and Dr. Lauren Olson, whose book, Finally Out, is still one of the few that addresses coming out after the age of 40. But as many of you know, the show evolved to focus on personal storytelling, and many of the most powerful stories came from listeners. Nearly every story elicited feedback. That's how I realized that this is what people wanted and needed. So I want to say thank you again to those of you who had the courage to come and share your story. Early on, we had a private group on Facebook, but there was a valid privacy concern with Facebook. That's why we moved to MeWe. But since MeWe is not part of most people's routine, the group has remained fairly small. However, recently it has been starting to grow. If you're a member and you haven't been there for a while, I encourage you to return. Or if you want to join, just email me at grainrainbows@gmail.com. But much of the power of Grain Rainbows is going on behind the scenes. I've been incredibly enriched by everyone who has taken the time to write to me. I've never done an official audience survey, but from the emails I know that listeners vary not just in age, but also in where they are on their journey. One of the first things most of us learn is that coming out is never done. No matter how publicly or privately you approach things, every time you meet someone new, you have to decide how much to share. Of course, the first and arguably the most important step is coming out to yourself. Ironically, that is often not necessarily one and done either. Some people see themselves as bisexual and then gradually see themselves as same-sex attracted. Other people that see themselves as same-sex attracted eventually realize they're transgender. One of the earliest guests on the show talked about the challenge of being in a lesbian relationship in which her partner had decided to transition. One thing that I've learned, thanks to those of you who have reached out to me, is that there are many obstacles to moving beyond this first coming out. For a mature adult, one of the most common challenges is being in a long-term marriage to someone that you still love. For women, there can also be issues of financial dependency, while men feel an ongoing sense of responsibility. And even if both spouses have the financial means to go their separate ways, that doesn't mean they should. If you do want to leave your spouse, then the next step is clear. But if you want to stay with your spouse, the decision about whether to come out is very, very difficult. I would not presume to offer advice because everyone's situation is different. I can only share what I've learned from listener feedback. Keeping this secret seems to take its toll on people's mental health. I think it's only fair that I share a bit of my own personal experience. Although I did not come out publicly until about 6 months after my husband's death in 2015, I told him about my attraction to women back in 1995. We decided to stay married because of our deep friendship. But I also have to acknowledge that he never really believed I was a lesbian, possibly because I only had one brief affair back in 1980. Obviously, coming out to your spouse is more complicated if you don't intend to remain monogamous. This issue is underrepresented in the episodes of Graying Rainbows for obvious reasons. Guests have been able to talk more freely about relationships with children and parents, as well as religious issues. If you listen from outside the United States, you might find this last topic rather puzzling. But as a person who lives in the American South, I can attest that it is bigger than the bigotry of certain conservative denominations. Especially as people grow older, church can be a major source of community. That's another reason why it can be a major obstacle when coming out later in life. But most of you already know what the challenges and obstacles are. The reason I talk about them explicitly is for the sake of younger listeners and allies who might not understand what you're going through. The great thing about the personal stories that have been shared over the last 3 years is that they provide real-life inspiration, no matter where you are in the journey. I love the guest who described herself as being in the messy middle. To be honest, my own personal life has been fairly uneventful over the last 3 years, but I have made several really good friends thanks to this podcast. Now I want to share some of the lessons I've learned both from emails and from my guests. First, things rarely go as expected. When I reflect back on all the stories that have been shared with me over the last 3 years, 2 things really stand out: the value of patience and the destructive power of regret. Many people report that when they first come out publicly, they don't always get the reaction that they expected. Often, support comes from a surprising source, while the person who reacts negatively comes as a complete shock. It's important not to assume that the person that you're telling has a clue, even if you think they should. They may need time to absorb the news. And if it's someone really close, like a parent, sibling, spouse, or child, their first reaction may reflect fear but be manifest as anger. They don't know what it's going to mean to their life. They don't know how it will affect them. Many of my guests reported that important relationships took years to recover, but they were able to recover because they left the door open rather than cutting that person off. There are those who will cut you out of their life, but you have a choice about how you treat them in return. So why come out at all? I discussed this question in more detail in episode 15. Obviously, it's your choice. In talking with those who struggled for years before coming out, two issues stand out. Many suffered from mental health challenges, and everyone agreed that they felt coming out was important to achieving self-acceptance and a sense of authenticity. I was personally fortunate that although I did not come out publicly until age 60, I never felt like I had to pretend to be someone I was not. Obviously, generations of LGBT plus people have had to live in the closet to survive. But now our choices are more complex. One theme I think I mentioned earlier was the destructive power of regret. I see this reflected in many of the emails that I receive. First, I think it's important to acknowledge that not everyone can or should come out publicly. Safety is the most obvious reason, but not hurting a vulnerable spouse is equally valid. Just like people often stay in marriages until after their children are grown, no one else can be the judge of what is right for you. The biggest problem with waiting is that it seems to destroy people from the inside out. Whatever you decide to do, don't destroy yourself with regret. All you can do is make the best choice based on your present circumstances. I hope listening to the stories of others will both inspire you and remind you that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to this dilemma. This is just my opinion, but I think that as long as you are honest with yourself, you can live a life of integrity, no matter what your external circumstances happen to be. I want to close this section by repeating my thanks and appreciation to those of you who have sent me feedback, and especially those of you who have shared your stories on the show. So what's next for Graying Rainbows? Obviously, the COVID pandemic has added a new challenge to those of us coming out LGBT plus later in life. It has certainly made it difficult to meet new people, but it has also given us a chance to reevaluate our priorities. I live in the United States, where scientific illiteracy and anti-science attitudes have cost thousands of lives. As a palliative medicine physician, I've been caring for veterans with COVID, and this has given me a close-up view of the tolls of the pandemic, even though I haven't lost anyone personally. Before I started Graying Rainbows, my podcasts, Brain Science and Books and Ideas, focused on bringing accurate science to listeners of all backgrounds. Now more than ever, I think it's critical that non-scientists understand how science really works. My current focus is on brain science because I think that understanding the basics of neuroscience is critical to being a good citizen in the 21st century. Creating Graying Rainbows has been a very rewarding experience, but I've decided to stop producing new episodes on a regular basis. However, all the episodes will continue to be freely available to you and future listeners. If you're subscribed, I hope you will stay subscribed just in case I put out a special episode in the future. The MeWe group will continue to accept new members. Just email me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com if you want to have a safe, private place to connect with others. I want to thank you again for listening and for sharing the show with others. I also want to encourage you to continue to send me emails. I'll be happy to continue to correspond with new people, and especially with those of you that I'm already corresponding with. No matter when you're listening, I hope you'll email me at grainrainbows@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and please do check out my other podcasts, Brain Science and Books and Ideas. Grain Rainbows is copyright 2021 to Dr. Virginia Campbell. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grainrainbows@gmail.com.